Hello and welcome to the first webinar in the Spitalfields Trust series. I'm looking at the history and culture of Brick Lane, the surrounding area, and the threats to this site. I'm one of the trustees of the Spitalfields Trust. My name is Eloise Palin. The Trust is a heritage organisation and building preservation trust. It was founded in Spitalfields in 1977 and it's still based in the area. So the current threat that we're talking about is a planning application which is directly on Brick Lane. On the junction with Woodseer Street, is right on that corner. The development is actually also called Woodseer Street. It's for a 4-storey large block taking up the whole of that junction. The upper stories will be big corporate open floor plan office spaces, and the ground floor will be retail. If permitted, this would, needless to say, really transform the character of Brick Lane at this junction and this area, and would set a worrying precedent for development, I think, around Brick Lane too. And inevitably then would also have a knock-on effect on the communities who live and work. And as we know, the Bangladeshi community is a major part of the character of this area and the people who live here. So to discuss this evening, we're really lucky to have some really fantastic people. We're going to start with Professor Claire Alexander, who was one of the authors of the Runnymede Trust report, Beyond Banglatown, Continuity, Change and New Urban Economies in Brick Lane. She'll be followed by Dr. Fatima Rejina and Tasnima Uddin, co-founders of the radical Socialist Bangladeshi group Nijjor Manush. They will be followed by Councillor Abdal Ullah, founder of the British Bangladeshi Power and Inspiration Foundation. He was brought up in Brick Lane and is now a local councillor for the St Catherine's and Wapping wards. They will each speak for sort of 10-15 minutes, and we will then hopefully have a discussion. Raja Musawi from the Greater London Authority's Culture at Risk Office will also be joining our discussion. And if people would like to submit some questions, then please do that via the Q&A function, or you can, or through the chat is absolutely fine as well. So I will hand over to Claire Alexander, and I'm going to share her.
Thank you, Eloise. I've asked Eloise to do the technical stuff because I'm hopeless at that kind of thing. So hopefully it will go smoothly. Let me start while we're, great, okay, perfect. So if you can move on to the first slide, the next slide, please, thank you. So first I want to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak at this webinar about the work that colleagues and I have been doing over the past 2 years on the Indian restaurant trade in what I always think of as kind of Bengali Brick Lane. And can you please just assume when I say Indian, it's in inverted commas, because actually it's pretty much wholly Bangladeshi, but it's just kind of quicker to say. So my presentation today really acts as a backdrop to the contributions of my co-panelists. I'm very acutely aware that they know much more about Brick Lane than I do. So I'm really just kind of setting the very general scene, as it were. And my talk's in 3 parts. Firstly, setting out a picture of what Brick Lane is like now, and particularly Bengali Brick Lane and how that stood just before the first lockdown about this time last year. Secondly, say a very few words about the history of Banglatown, which I think and hope will point to the reason why Brick Lane is so important to the British Bangladeshi community. And then thirdly, looking at some of the key challenges that came up in our research that were already facing Brick Lane even before the pandemic. And then with a very brief insight into what we've learned very recently since the lockdown has kind of happened. So just about the project very quickly, I'll tell you a few words. The project was a 2-year study funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It ran from July 2018 to June 2020. The project team was colleagues at Manchester, Cambridge and the LSE. So there was myself and Dr. Sean Carey, who some of you may know at Manchester, Joya Chatterjee and Sandeep Litter at Cambridge, and Suzanne Hall and Julia King at the LSE. And the project actually built on 2 earlier studies that we've been doing. So Sean's earlier research on the Indian restaurants in Brick Lane for the Institute of Community Studies, Curry Capital, which was 2003, 2004, and is brilliant if any of you want to know more about that. And a project that I did with Joya in 2006 to 2009, which was about Bengali migration in the post-partition period in South Asia and Britain. And one of the key sites we looked at there was, of course, Tower Hamlets and Brick Lane as a kind of iconic part of what the British Bangladeshi community is. And that work can be found on the Bangla Stories website, and I've got some links at the end of this for that. So the project did three things. We did some archival research into the history of Bengali migration to Britain and East London and the rise and the creation of Banglatown. Secondly, we did a visual mapping of the street and a street survey looking at the businesses along the whole length of the street and how those had changed since 2014. And thirdly, a more qualitative kind of detailed survey and in-depth interviews with the restaurant owners, Bangladeshi restaurant owners along Brick Lane. And there's a project website for that on, which is Beyond Banglatown.org.uk, and again, the links at the end. And that also includes a short film and a summary of our findings that were produced in the Runnymede report that Eloise mentioned. And we're currently doing a 9-month kind of follow-up to this study funded by the Economic and Social Research Council as part of CODE, the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity in Manchester, looking at the impact of the pandemic on racial and ethnic minorities. And we're hoping we will actually be able to do that when we're actually allowed out, which will be nice. A quick point before I move on to the project findings, which is to say that although the project focused on Brick Lane, it tells a much bigger story, particularly around the significance of the Indian restaurant trade in Britain, the role of Bangladeshi, British Bangladeshis in this trade. So as context, it's estimated that the Indian catering sector is worth about £3.5 to £4 billion annually. It comprises about 10,000 businesses and about 80,000 employees. About 80 to 85% of the sector is owned and run by Bangladeshis. About 60% of Bangladeshi men and 30% of Bangladeshi women are employed in the hotel and catering sector. And about 25% of Bangladeshi men are employed as chefs, cooks, or waiters. So it's of huge significance to the British Bangladeshi community. And Brick Lane, in some ways, it kind of encapsulates, it captures this importance, and also that kind of amplifies the threats that are there to the sector and to the broader community. And this is even before COVID started to bite. And of course, it's also worth pointing out the kind of huge symbolic and economic importance that Indian food, broadly defined, has to our ideas of what Britishness is, British history and British culture, and how it reflects that idea of kind of multicultural Britain. So next slide, please. So yeah, so the main findings from the study was the changing face of the businesses in Brick Lane generally, particularly the regeneration of the northern half of the street, so up from the Truman Brewery, and the decline of the Indian restaurants at the southern end of Brick Lane, which is known as Banglatown. And we found that from the mid-2000s, when I was doing my work for the Bengal Diaspora Project, when Banglatown was probably at its height, and there were about 60 restaurants. When we went back to do the study in 2018, there were only 23 left. So that's a 62% decrease in 15 years. And the mapping undertaken by Susie and Julia showed that since the 2003 London plan, the northern end of Brick Lane has been developed into a mix of retail outlets. The opening of Shoreditch High Street, Overground Station, has really drawn footfall to that end of the street, very much at the expense of the other end, the southern end. Along Brick Lane, about 56% of the shops have been open for 10 years, 44% for less than 5 years, which shows there's quite a rapid kind of turnover and transformation. 43% of the retail outlets were dedicated to food and drink. And the largest proportion of the businesses by far, that was the kind of largest sector of businesses by far, but the share of Indian restaurants in that had declined from 19% in 2014 to only 10% in 2018. So across that 4 years, the input was about half. We noted a change in consumer demographic with stores being strongly oriented towards the tourist market and an increasingly gentrified consumer, as well as students. So we saw three trends: the emergence of niche outlets, such as things like the dark sugars, chocolates, which are fabulous, the changing use of Bangladeshi restaurants into other kinds of food retail, So 80% of the Bangladeshi restaurants that closed were reopened as some other kind of food outlet. An outlet's emerging, catering to an emerging kind of student hipster market, so the vegan cafes, things like that. However, importantly, of the Indian restaurants we surveyed, we discovered that the vast majority of the owners and employees live locally, and that most of their produce was also sourced locally. So at places like Banglatown, cash and carry Taj stores. And this points to a very strong sense of community identity and ownership, but it also means, of course, that the money stays within the community, it circulates there with a local multiplier effect. But it's also apparent that only 2/3 of the people we interviewed, the restaurant owners we interviewed, were breaking even or making a profit pre-pandemic, with a third saying that they were losing money. So it was pretty precarious even before the pandemic. So we can move on, you'll see these visually. So the next slide should show, so you can see 2014 and the marked in red are the curry restaurants, and you can see how they've declined massively in that 5 years up to 2019. And if you move on to the next slide, you can see this is the sectoral shift, and you can see the size of the food and drink sector and then the place of the curry restaurants within that, and the way in which that's shrunk. Anyway, okay, so what I want to do now is say a few things about the history of the Bangladeshi community in Brick Lane, which I think points to why it's so important to the Bangladeshi community in Britain more generally, but also to the longer history of the East End. And I think that's often underplayed. So if we can move on to the next slide. So the first point to make is there's been a long and important connection between Bengal and London, which predates the arrival of large numbers of Bangladeshis in the 1970s. And it also explains why Bangladesh settled in East London. So we know that there were Bengalis recruited by the East India Company from the 17th century onwards. And there's a long history of Bengalis working in the merchant navy as Lascars. And these ships often docked in London, just in the East End. And many of the Lascars were discharged there, or they jumped ship, or their contracts ended, or they were just kind of left to sort themselves out. And of course, many sailors settled in East London after World War I when they were discharged from the Navy. So you get a small settled community from the 1920s onwards, and the contemporary restaurant trade has its roots in that kind of history, in those coffee houses that were there catering to this quite small community. So the first restaurant is really the Shah Jalal restaurant on Commercial Street, which was run by Ayub Ali Master, who was part of that kind of sailing community. As the community grew through the post-war migration, the Star Cafe opened in 1958, and then the following year, the Bombay restaurant, owned by Mr. Patel, who is something of a local legend, I understand. And Patel would later open the Clifton restaurant at 124 Brick Lane in 1967, which was the first licensed restaurant catering mainly to British diners. The Bangladeshi community grew through the 1970s, partly as unemployment grew across the country and people that had been working elsewhere returned back to London to settle with friends and family. And they were then later joined by their families in the wake of the Liberation War. And through the 1970s, the Bangladeshis had to fight very high levels of racism on the street, and also in local government in areas like housing. And of course, most notably after the murder of Altab Ali in 1978. So Brick Lane became very much the kind of center of Bangladeshi anti-racist struggle. And it became known as the cultural heartland of the British Bangladeshi community because of these struggles, and because literally in many places, it was really the only place that Bangladeshis felt that they were safe. And many of the young men that took up that fight at that time are those that later moved into the restaurant trade and have been at the forefront for the push for Banglatown, the establishment of the Shahid Minar and the Mellah. So by 1980, there were 4 restaurants and 4 cafes along Brick Lane. And as the traditional leather and clothing industries declined, the focus shifted to the restaurant trade in Brick Lane, as it did across the country. In the early 1990s, the idea of Banglatown emerged, and this sought to kind of redevelop Brick Lane as a cultural destination, a cultural quarter, to attract young and affluent visitors from nearby offices and other parts of London. The Banglatown brand has been used since then as a marketing tool to promote new annual street festivals on Brick Lane, so the Mellah, of course, Brick Lane Festival and the Curry Festival. By 2003, there were 46 restaurants Indian restaurants on Brick Lane. And as I said, that at its peak, it reached over 60 along Brick Lane and in the kind of surrounding streets. So as I said at the beginning, this next slide, please. The restaurant trades declined dramatically across that period, since that peak in the kind of mid 2000s. There are now only 23 restaurants and cafes left. And I suspect there may be less than that once lockdown lifts. So some of the key challenges that our research revealed were firstly, rental costs. So very few of the business owners own the freehold to their premises. Out of the 23 restaurants, only 7 own the freehold. And this has serious implications for rental prices, which have been spiraling out of control. Rental prices in the area are around 20% higher than the London average. So many business owners were literally priced out of the market. Secondly, the council vision for regeneration of the street seemed not to have taken any account at all of the Bangladeshi voice or history of the areas. And there's been a move towards micro businesses and creative industries, which have pretty much ignored the Bangladeshi contribution to the area economically and historically. Thirdly, there's been a change in market and consumer tastes. We've seen the rise in different kinds of kind of regional cuisines and Indian street food places like Dishoom. And the restaurants in Brick Lane have been slow in adapting to some of those changing tastes. Or there was an article, I think it was in The Guardian at the weekend, about the kind of failure to develop an authentic Bangladeshi kind of cuisine that people recognize. The customer base has shifted. So city workers and tourists have changed their eating habits. We've seen the rise of franchises like Pret, and people are popping out to get sandwiches rather than going out for lunch. And the nighttime economy has also shifted its focus northwards up towards Shoreditch, away from the Vibe Bar. So a lot of our restaurant owners that we spoke to the closure of the Vibe Bar as being crucial in kind of damaging their businesses. And finally, there have been internal changes too. So there have been issues around how to recruit skilled chefs from abroad because of migration controls. Younger British Bangladeshis are not drawn to the long hours and the low pay of the restaurant trade. So there's been a shift towards other kinds of kind of gig economy, taxis, delivery, that kind of thing. But also, I mean, because of the great educational attainment moves in and around Tower Hamlets, young British Bangladeshis have higher aspirations, bigger aspirations. They want to be kind of, you know, doctors and professionals and working in the city and not in the restaurant trade. So those aspirations have changed. Okay, so next slide, please. So these are the different resources which you can look at, which tell you the background to some of this stuff on the project. And of course, all of the stuff I've been painting out really only refers up to kind of February last year, so pre-pandemic. And my colleague Sean did a drive through Brick Lane last weekend, and he said that all of the Indian restaurants were closed, though 3 of the 4 cafes were open. But he said even those cafes, A, didn't seem to have much custom, and B, didn't seem to have many staff. One of the long-standing restaurants in the area has been reopened as a Thai restaurant. So the supermarkets and the sweet shops are open, but we don't know what's happening with the businesses. There's sign of some refurbishments, which speaks to a kind of optimism, I hope. But I have to say I'm concerned about what it will look like when Brick Lane and Banglatown opens up again after the pandemic. And that's me, thank you.
So we'll hand over to Dr. Fatima, Rejina and Tasnima Uddin now, please. Thanks.
Hi, sorry about that. I'm just going to share my screen. Hi everyone, my name is Tasnima Uddin. I'm one of the co-founders of Nijjor Manush. We are a radical independent campaigning group that aims to organise, educate and empower the Bangladeshis and Bengalis within the UK and internationally. So we are a group of young Bengalis who wanted to almost create a clear alternative for radical left, non-party politics for other Bengalis and Bangladeshis to engage in. All 10 of us come from various different backgrounds. Some of us have engaged with student politics, from community organizing backgrounds, academia. I myself am training to be a barrister. Nijjor Manush, we take inspiration from groups like the Asian Youth Movement and other autonomous Bengali political parties, political projects, at that time, like those that operated in East London and mainly in Brick Lane. In short, we want our politics to continue the radical legacies of our communities that fought fascist and state violence and strive to uphold principle of anti-racism and anti-capitalism. I'm just going to hand it over to Fatima now.
Thank you, Tasnima. First of all, thank you very much to Socialist Trust, to Eloise and others for putting on this event. It's a very necessary intervention for what is happening in Brick Lane. So just to introduce myself, my name is Dr. Fatima Rejina. I'm an academic. I'm currently a research fellow at the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre. So my research areas focus on race, Islamophobia, and specifically the British Bangladeshi community. And I completed my PhD at SOAS, where I actually looked at East London and the Bangladeshi community. And of course, I started my PhD in the Olympic year, so 2012, and I've been collecting photographs of Brick Lane since. And it has drastically changed. The landscape, the different cafes that Professor Alexander pointed out, and the restaurants, and even some of the sari shops that used to exist on Brick Lane. The last one that I managed to capture was in 2014 April, when the shutters were down of the famous sari centre, just before entering Brick Lane. So as an academic who is very much invested in this particular area, and also personal investment, it's something I've witnessed myself, that the sort of changes. But the thing that I want to focus on for this particular element of my talk is, so I'm also one of the co-founders of Nijjor Manush, where it's a group of 10 of us Bengalis who have come together to organize around various issues impacting the Bangladeshi community. And I think one of the things we sort of realized about this particular development that was brought to our attention last summer by Councillor Mia, contacted us and just said, look, what can we do? Can you help us in Tower Hamlets, because this is what's happening. And that's how Nijjor Manush got involved last summer. And so through speaking to Puru, we then launched an online campaign in collaboration with others who I'm going to talk about briefly. So we started off in June with a post on, so we're very active right now, particularly now because of the pandemic, of course, on sort of our social media platforms, Instagram, Twitter. And on Instagram, we posted our first set of sort of demands of the people who follow us, of what they can do to help with this, with the action against the Truman Brewery and how to challenge them. And this was in June. And then following June, of course, around December, there was another sort of, and between that, we had quite a few Zoom calls between sort of Nijjor Manush. We met those involved in East End Preservation Society. We had meetings with Socialist Trust as well. And that's when we realized there needs to be more that we do together, that we collaborate, we work together. And in December, I remember one of the Zoom calls we had actually discussed having an exhibition, which did go ahead on 25 Princelet Street. But sadly, because the lockdown was announced end of November, for December lockdown. And so, yeah, we couldn't go ahead because from our end, we were planning on having some elements of direct action involved, but we sadly couldn't go ahead because of the lockdown that was enforced. But having said all those things, when we did start putting out our content on social media, we had a huge reach. Just with our second post in December alone, we reached about 250,000 people. We obviously don't know if every single person who we reached emailed Tower Hamlets Council or not, but nonetheless, I think that's a significant amount of people we managed to reach in a short amount of time. And from there on, we witnessed Judas, the sort of a radical Jewish group. They offered their solidarity and support. Then we got support from Runnymede Trust. They put out a letter on their website, on their, again, across their social media platforms, offering their support, lending their solidarity to the people living in and around Brick Lane. And from there on, we were informed by Spitalfields Trust and others that sadly, Truman Brewery, despite not having received any kind of approval from the council, they still went ahead, and the pavements around the area were, I mean, they started the construction work on the pavement area. And so I think, you know, so that's what we managed to, that we were contributing towards as Nijjor Manush, and making sure we could reach out and reach as many people as possible. And we want to continue with this. And for this, I'm going to hand you over back to Tasnima, who will give some pointers and ideas that we have for now to galvanize people.
Okay, so I think I just want to, obviously, whoever is joining us from Nijjor Manush, from, you know, the Save the Brick Lane campaign, firstly, you know, just to thank you guys. Obviously, without this kind of mass mobilization of people online, it wouldn't have become what it is, the campaign, you know, is today. But also just to kind of emphasize, let's not stop online. Obviously, because of COVID, there's been loads of restrictions, especially around mobilizing, direct action, etc. So we have, you know, many ways to, I guess, mobilize in real life. And that's how we want, that's why we want everyone watching, you know, to be involved in real life with us. And just to, I think Fatima can help me out, but there's like 3 specific ways that we want people to get involved.
Yeah, so one of the things we were thinking of, so the 3 direct action points that we sort of came up with for this particular session, the first one is, hopefully with the lockdown easing, we were hoping to use the space on 25 Princelet Street to organise and mobilise people. And related to that is the second point, because I think it's quite important that we start driving a wedge between the residents who live in and around Brick Lane and the developers, because we have to get the residents on side, because I mean, I myself, I'm not from the area, so of course it doesn't directly impact me. So I think it's important and crucial that the residents themselves aren't just being used as sort of passive agents, but actually actively being brought on to inform and participate in sort of challenging the Truman Brewery for its expansion and for going ahead with its tasks, and that will involve, you know, retrieving and looking back at how battles were fought historically on Brick Lane. So if we look at, for example, the Jewish community, you know, fighting the fascists in the 30s, if we look at the Bangladeshi community, for one of our first events for Nijjor Manush that we held, we interviewed 2 elderly uncles who were involved in the anti-racist movement in the 70s following Al-Tawali's death, and they spoke about how they use their physical bodies to occupy Brick Lane, you know, the Battle of Brick Lane. So I think, you know, what we're sort of suggesting here isn't anything, I would say, revolutionary or sort of new. Actually, we're just trying to continue the tradition of the East End itself, of making sure of ensuring that the state and the local governing bodies, you know, the council in this instance, is aware that the people will not back down. And the third thing we were hoping to, sorry. Sorry, I thought maybe I ran over. Have I got enough time, Eloise?
No, you're fine. Carry on, Fatima. That wasn't me.
Okay, no worries. So the first point, organising on Princelet Street, especially with lockdown easing. Second, developing a relationship with the residents and bringing them on board and not having them sort of have some sort of substitutive role, but an active role in deciding how to go about things and challenging the Truman Brewery. And of course, alongside residents, it would be brilliant if we could get a lot of the local businesses on board, because from Nijjor Manush, we're aware that there are businesses who are receiving a lot of false information, information that's being disseminated about how they will benefit from this particular, 5-story or 4-story building that the Truman Brewery is hoping to develop there. So, to actually inform people of what is going to happen and the consequences of this development, and how gentrification will then impact the area. And in a sense, I would say, one of our colleagues from Nijjor Manush said this in a podcast last week, that this is almost a post-gentrification era we're seeing, because I mean that area has been gentrified. So we're now in this era where it's just a very hastened social cleansing of local working class communities, and not just the Bangladeshi community is something we want to emphasize, that yes, they make up the significant demographic in the area, but we recognize there are other communities who Brick Lane is also their home, so not that it's just about the Bangladeshi community. And the third action point is that, again, once things are eased up, we are hoping that we can organise alongside Spitalfields Trust, with councillors who are on board, with the East End Preservation Society, a day of action where we can bring multiple different stakeholders together to come up with a timeline of potential sort of actions, direct actions, which are not just within the sort of online, within an online capacity, but also where we are physically turning up to, whether it means, occupying buildings and so on and so forth. So we want to consider that as an option also. But I'm going to hand you back to Tasnima, and then thank you very much for listening to me.
Yeah, just to just go off Fatima's kind of last point, I think we need to we need to start making it very visible about what's happening in Brick Lane, and we need to start driving a wedge between those living around Brick Lane and the developers. And we need to start building on, in real life, pressure for Truman Brewery, pressure from the council as well. There's a lot of there is a lot of people going around Brick Lane and spreading misinformation to a lot of small businesses, and those are kind of the things that we need to counteract as well. And we need to do this, all together, as in numbers we are strength. So the Truman Brewery need to, I guess, see the online visibility in real life. Yeah, so I think that's all from me and Fatima.
Great, thank you both so much. We'll hand over to Councillor Abdal Ullah then, please. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you very much. Although for the introduction and opportunity to speak to everyone here, thanks to the Spitalfields Trust for putting this on. And I make it clear from the outset that yes, I do have a role as a councillor in Tower Hamlets for another part of the borough, St Catherine's and Wapping. But my reason for being here and my sort of, I guess, feeling a sense of belonging is that I'm what I call a child of Brick Lane, having arrived with my mother. My late father used to live in Brick Lane from all his age, all his life. I couldn't unfortunately show you, but I've got a great picture of my father looking very dapper in the 60s in Princelet Street, where he lived with a lot of his cousins and relatives. So I'm going to talk from my point of view of what Brick Lane means to me, what it meant to my father. And I have 2 sons now who, on a regular basis, that I take them to Brick Lane to do our weekly bit of shopping in Taj store and buy some wonderful food from Grand Bangla. So I'll start off by what Brick Lane meant to me, to what I understood from my late father. He and his friends lived around Brick Lane, in Brick Lane. Their whole social life, the network, kinship was around Brick Lane. The late Abdal Ullah in 1978, although he lived on the night of the murder in Wapping, where I'm a councillor in Reardon House, most of his association, most of his friendship was around Brick Lane. My father and Abdal Ullah came from the same area in Bangladesh, Satoh. And so on that dreaded night on the 4th of May when he was killed, it sent shockwaves to the many garment workers, many young Bangladeshi men about their safety and fear. When I first arrived in London in '84, the stories of Al-Tabali was very fresh, because of the close connection to the rag traders, the people working in the factories, many people, adults. As a child, I would overhear stories about, the safety of them walking around. Obviously, it was still fresh. The BNP National Front was still present and around East London. So there was always a concern about that. So as a child growing up in Brick Lane was probably one of the best things the life is so different now than it was then. I'm talking about '84, how strong Bangladeshi presence in Brick Lane. It was the boom before the kind of called Britannia. The Bangladeshis had an identity, the sari shops, the music cassette shops, the guys who would work far end in the restaurant would come on a Monday night, preferentially the kind of the day off for the many restaurant workers to buy their DVD, not DVD cassettes in the old days for the Bollywood films, and the cafes and Sweet and Spicy would be packed to the rafters with people enjoying slight snacks and so forth. It was a different atmosphere, a different time. However, things change, and I remember, the timeline. As I said, '71 was important as a liberation of Bangladesh. Many struggles, many meetings were held. My father mentioned about how they would group together to send money to Bangladesh for the liberation war. '78 had an impact on their lives, and a lot of the battles of Brick Lane, we now refer to the heroes of '78, the Al-Tabali, post-Al-Tabali death, the movement to claim the identity, to say we're here to stay, seeking better rights, protection, the squatting in terms of when families started to arrive in the East End, squatting into a council property because a lot of the Bangladeshi families were not being adequately housed by then the council. I know that a lot of researchers, a lot of academics want to talk about it, but we have what I call lived experience. From number 4 Brick Lane, where I grew up with my family, when my father wanted to move into a council property, it was taking forever. But then due to the help and support of a local activist, we were able to squat into Chickson House. That was our means to getting into a social ladder property, because the council were too slow or weren't being supportive enough. But lucky for us, the house that we did squat in, break into on a Friday evening, was deemed for a regeneration project office. Spitalfield was getting a regeneration in the early 90s, and Chickson House office was deemed to be the construction office for the City Challenge regeneration program. So I guess we were an inconvenience to the regeneration program. So they offered my father an opportunity to move, 2 options, one to Bow and the other one to Wapping. And the rest is history. My father chose the latter, and we've been in St. Catherine's and Wapping for the last 30 years. However, in that timeline of Brick Lane, I've personally experienced many changes. The Brick Lane nail bombing, that once again united the community. This lone wolf came to sort of cause pain. And the idiot, the ill-equipped and uneducated that he was, he wanted to attack the Bangladeshi community on a Saturday when Brick Lane is probably the most quietest at that time, because for 2 reasons. The historical Jewish community that was around Brick Lane, so all the fabric shops and all the other, were closed on a Saturday. But also the Bangladeshi community, wouldn't be in Brick Lane in the early sort of late afternoon until the evening, when the restaurants would open at 6 o'clock and so forth. So the nail bombing didn't cause that much damage. The 20th anniversary of the nail bombing, we kind of had a plaque put outside the Brick Lane police station and held a vigil in order for that lone wolf who tried to divide London and divide the BAME community, and targeting obviously the Bangladeshi community in Brick Lane. Moving on to in sort of the late 90s, there was the kind of the identifying the Bangladeshi community would be, the younger generation, my generation, would sort of be bringing a new identity. I mean, Brick Lane became cool because it was featured on various programs and so forth, but the vibe bar I guess the Truman was at the height, in a sense, of cool Britannia. Talvin Singh on a Sunday afternoon would be doing his sessions at the Vibe Bar. And, you know, so there was like a parallel life of 2 Brick Lane. You had the North End, which was sort of aimed at the more kind of the new generation of, they're not yuppies, but they're sort of cool Britannia, kind of the wanted to be around Brick Lane, edgy and cool, but yet not necessarily engaged with the south part of Brick Lane, predominantly Bangladeshi on the east side, Chicksan Estate and so forth. There was a lot of new property being bought up, snapped up on Prince Street, Fournier Street, you know, being redone and in historical context, but they also wasn't engaging with the other side of Brick Lane. So there was a different parallel life. I remember doing something with BBC London, a big feature story around how, you know, people in Brick Lane were being priced out. The small corner shops, the small shops were being bought out by fancy secondhand retro shops, furniture shops, you know, were selling small item of furniture for £600-700, which was almost like a month's salary for a Bangladeshi working for long hours in the restaurant. I know Alexander talked about the finding for the Runnymede Trust. I mean, I remember talking in preparation for this, I was talking to the new director of Runnymede Trust, Halima Begum, who is a child of Brick Lane herself. We grew up in around Brick Lane. And we talked about how, you know, the people comparison who wanted to be around Brick Lane, wanted to be around this gateway for the immigrants, but yet what sort of detached, you know, the academics or the film producers and musicians, whatever, they all wanted to come to Brick Lane, but wasn't exactly walking in the shoes of the local Bangladeshi living in the council estate. And so it's been interesting for me as a person of Bangladeshi background who has on, you know, as I said, I moved out of Brick Lane in the 90s, but my father's connections, my family, my extended family, are you know, we would be in Brick Lane 4 or 5 times a week, you know, to sort of do our shopping, to do our mingling and so forth. So it's been an interesting journey. But I guess for me, what really struck home is what's been my defining moment is that for me, Brick Lane is more than a street. You know, Brick Lane has been a gateway for many hundreds of years for the immigrant community. But for me on a personal journey, for my late father, for me, and as I say, I take my children for them to understand what Brick Lane is. So it's a legacy work. So as Bangladesh celebrates 50th anniversary starting on this Friday, the 26th of March, I'm working both as an individual and my organization, the BBPI, British Bangladeshi Power and Inspiration, to kind of shine a light on the Bangladeshis' contribution to the East End. One of the things that we will be doing is profiling 50 individuals, photos of what I call everyday people of Brick Lane, not the rich, not the wealthy, not the restaurant owners, but generally everyday people, from the ladies from the household to the guy who worked on the fabrics and the rag trades to the road sweeper. We want to identify and sort of share the stories of 50 people of Brick Lane, the real lives and real stories of Brick Lane. Growing up, one of my earliest memories of Brick Lane, or particularly in Chicksand, was the famous art installation on the wall next to the sunken football pitch, commonly known as the Gut. That picture, for those who want to Google it, will see it was an amazing picture of post-78, the Altabali, the Chicksand estate, the rag traders, the Jewish community. And interestingly, there was a picture of a bowler hat man. It's sort of like creeping into the East End, the city kind of, you know, moving east. And fast forward 30 something years later, we're now talking about this amazing campaign that the Spitalfield and Nijjor Manush are doing about how, you know, a little bit of Brooklyn is taking shape in the north end of Brick Lane. And I think that is a sad story of how, you know, as I said, regeneration is good when it brings opportunities for all. But this is an exclusive enclave of a very high-end shops and an office space, which will kind of like kill away completely the fabric of Brick Lane. So I really hope as we celebrate 50 years of Bangladeshi community's contribution to the East End, Bangladeshi community's legacy in the East End, that this is not the beginning of the end of the Bangladeshi identity. I mean, Brick Lane Mosque has been a pinnacle of the Bangladeshi community. We're doing a little bit of work at the moment with the Venice Museum, doing an exhibition on Brick Lane Mosque. And I remember being asked a question by the researcher, you know, it's moved through 3 Abrahamic faiths. what happens after the Muslim community or the Bangladeshi community is completely moved. And I said, I really don't want to think about that. I want to see my children, my children's children feel that the Bangladesh community, the Brick Lane, is a gateway. It's their place, it's their street with all other communities. Everyone's left a legacy, but I want to see the Bangladeshi community go on for many, many, many years, having a presence in Brick Lane, be it through the business, commerce, be it through the cultural, Nazrul Center, being a flagship of iconically, as we celebrate 50 years, one of the projects that I'm really putting forward to the council is by the Banglatown gate on the beginning of Brick Lane, is to have a street art, commissioning. I want to commission one of the leading British Bangladeshi artists, street artist, Muhammad Ali, to do an art project on the wall by Hopetown, is so that when generations to come, they see this amazing artwork that's sort of similar to what we've got in the Battle of Cable Street or the other famous art murals around London, that the Bangladeshi community's presence is felt, even if all the shops become barbershops and vegan, which I hope they don't, but I hope some of the restaurants, from the 60 odd restaurants at the height of the 90 to now 20 odd, that the finer ones retain, are kept. And places like Grand Bangla will continue to survive because it serves the authentic Bangladeshi cuisine. And so I guess, my earliest fond memory of Brick Lane, it was home away from home. It was a place where Bangladeshis, as academics and researchers say, that Bangladeshis felt safe. It was a place they felt, but it was because they felt safe because they've made it safe. Those battles with the National Front, skinheads on the north end of Brick Lane, and friends like Dan Jones and others, coming to support the Bangladeshi community. It was that empowerment of 78, which empowered the British Bangladeshi to feel like this is our home. We will make Brick Lane, our small capital, and that has been the movement. And I'm really, feel proud that young British Bangladeshis, younger than me, are taking up that mantra of keeping the spirit of 78 alive. Many have tried to divide, many have tried to wedge a gap in the, be the greedy landlord, pricing out the Bangladeshi, or the different entities that have come to divide the Bangladeshi business communities. But I think, even recently, and I'm not necessarily criticizing, but the rather interesting idea of closing Brick Lane in the middle of COVID to reduce traffic so that, we could let people walk and around Brick Lane. I personally felt that was a wrong idea. And I've advised and I've spoken quite strongly with the mayor to say, look, what Brick Lane needs is a through road. Brick Lane needs that traffic because, if you're going to carry a big sack of rice and onion and an oil drum from Taj store, you can't really do that on a bike. So we need to manage expectation. We've got a small number of calves that are surviving, as because of COVID, they are doing trade by Uber. People on bikes and scooters, they need to come into Brick Lane to pick up their delivery and go and deliver. So by closing Brick Lane completely to traffic, as much as it might be attracting to the 18,000 at the peak on a weekend who like to walk around Brick Lane, that isn't going to be conducive to the local small businesses. And without those small Bangladeshi businesses, then you don't have Brick Lane of the last 50 years. What you will have is a number of barbershops and few, latte drinking places that are unexactly imaginative. That isn't in spirit of Brick Lane. So I really hope that we're able to strike a balance in the council, as well as strike a balance with the developers and, the brothers who own the Truman Brewery site. When they got their money together and bought it for 5 million, I guess they weren't thinking that 20, 30 years later, it would be worth $1 billion and more, and they will be able to bring in corporate, companies. So I hope we can find a balance. And I really hope the memory of this COVID has been so brutal. Brick Lane Mosque has had 7 funerals per day. And we've seen so many key individuals whose hard work, who suffered, who worked hard to make Brick Lane the iconic street that is, and be the heartbeat of the British Bangladesh community, lost without a send-off. So I hope as we celebrate 50th anniversary of Bangladesh, that we find it a fitting way to remember them. We find a fitting way to kind of hold on to what they built, which is a Brick Lane that is inclusive, Brick Lane that is been a street of hope and aspiration and dream And I hope, as we can do justice to that. So I think I've taken a lot of time, so I look forward to some question engagement with the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. In fact, thank you all. You were all completely fantastic and really, really interesting. I should have explained at the beginning that the site that we're worried about, the planning application, is in the middle of the Truman Brewery site, which really is the divide in some ways, the sort of notional divide between North Brick Lane and South, and the sort of different characters of the two ends. Raja, I wondered if you wanted to start with a question. And we do have one question from the audience, which I might put forward if not. I wondered also if our panelists would mind turning their cameras on so we can see their lovely faces. Okay, maybe I will start then with the question. So we've had a question from Janice Pearson, and she's asked the question, how much does the local community already know about what's going on, what the general feeling is? And do we have a clear picture of their reaction? And I think actually that's quite a difficult thing to engage with at the moment. And Fatima and Tasnima did touch on the fact that there is quite a lot of misinformation that's being spread at the moment, and certainly the Truman Brewery, the owners, they own a huge amount of the land in the area, and so therefore have a lot of sway in terms of opinion. But over to you, to any of you guys who want to start. Fatima, Tasmin, did you want to start on that?
So the question was, how much do the locals know?
How much do we think that the people who live there and work there really know about what's going on?
So from one thing we were allowed to share publicly was the Bangla cash and carry, just they're just behind Hanbury Street. So they've been impacted by it, and they've been having conversations with people about that it may potentially close because of the way this development is going to encroach into that space. And if that closes, then that is because where you have that fancy hotel now opposite Fournier Street, opposite where the mosque is, and Shah Jalal, or is it called Raj Mahal Sweet Shop, that used to be one of the biggest cash and carry shops. I don't know if anyone remembers, and obviously that closed down because this fancy hotel was put up there during the Olympic. It was lead up to the Olympic year, I remember. So the Bangla Cash and Carry have sort of come forward and shared a lot of things about how there are concerns around what will happen to their business because of various coercions they're experiencing from the Truman Brewery, and we have shared this across our social media with their permission. And so they are having conversations with local people who come to buy their shopping from there, because again, the Bangladeshi community makes up one of the largest demographics in the area who rely on Taj stores and Bangla Cash and Carry to buy their basic necessities. And again, conversations with Puru Mia, the councillor, who has been involved locally, and there has been conversations between him and others locally, and it seems like they are aware. But I feel like it's the pandemic that's making people feel rather helpless because they don't know what they can do and how many more letters can be sent or emails, because I feel like that's one aspect I think perhaps we have, so the capacity of doing that. I think we've sort of reached the capacity for that. So I think this is why I think following the lockdown lifting in April, I think there's really a lot of potential here for us to tap in and really use it almost as a moment to canvass the local people, like you would during an election, canvass, turn up, those of us who speak Bengali, turn up knocking on people's doors. So when we say
You've broken up there.
Action, we mean physically turning up to those spaces. Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that I find really troubling is a shopping mall literally bang in the middle of Brick Lane. I mean, Westfields is just a few stops on the Central Line from East London. So the idea of a shopping mall bringing jobs and everything, I find rather disingenuous from developers, because we know that these jobs, they barely pay the London living wage, and they again usually in the hospitality sector, which we've heard from Professor Alexander is occupied by a lot of Bengalis already. And again, this idea of just sort of holding onto this community to just you know, sort of maneuver into that industry, whereas as if there are no other ways for Bangladeshis to exist in the area and aspire to be other things. So I just find it really quite patronizing and infantilizing, actually, the idea that we're going to bring you jobs, which of course is not the case. So I hope I've answered your question. Sadly, because of the lockdown and because of the pandemic, it's been difficult to, I guess, collect statistics, but hopefully with the lockdown lifting, we do intend to go there and actually physically start talking to people and gathering more and more evidence, I guess, of how local people feel about it.
Can I just add that to say, a few years ago, there was another big campaign, which was community led, which was to stop the Crossrail tunnel being in the junction of Hanbury Street. And in fact, Banglatown Cash and Carry was one of the businesses that was deemed to be at the expense of a new shaft. So the community led a very powerful Bangladeshi led campaign to change the direction of the shaft that was going to be in Brick Lane for 10 years. There's, you know, obviously Crossrail is still, you know, happening. It's been delayed. So there was a massive campaign led by a number of Bangladeshis to say, no, we will not have you come and put a shaft in the middle of Banglatown and make, you know, well, for many years, the streets would have been shut. All that, you know, lorries would have come in and made the place unattractive for businesses. So that was a very successful campaign. For those of us with sort of long memories know that there's been other campaigns, others have tried to come and break Banglatown, and they failed, you know. So from the BNPs to the Crossrails, you know, the Bangladeshi community have won over and kept Brick Lane as it is. So I hope that, you know, this new campaign will also be and the Bangladeshis are quite well, I won't say radical, but what I was going to say is quite proactive in politics. You know, we do like to come out and vote many times. So I hope this is an opportunity post March, April, that we can be quite vocal back in the area.
Yeah, no, that's it. Roger, is there anything that you would like to ask? I'm aware that we've only got a few minutes left.
Yes, I'm sorry for missing the first opportunity. I had a slight glitch. I just wanted to just quickly touch in with Claire, because I know in reading the Runnymede Trust report, there was a series of recommendations that were made at the end about, you know, what could be done to sort of address some of these broader issues. I suppose just, you know, there's the question of the development and the impact it could have on the street, but some of the kind of wider challenges, I suppose, about the risks to the cultural heritage of the street and the communities that live there. So I just wanted to see if there's an opportunity to revisit some of those recommendations for the group, because I thought that that would be really interesting, and whether you think that those have kind of evolved since the crisis has started.
I mean, no, because we haven't been really been able to go down to Brick Lane and do, so we're not quite sure what the current situation. I'm imagining it's just made things quite a lot worse than they were already kind of difficult even a year ago. So our recommendations broadly were that there should be proper consultation. If you're going to consult, you have to consult, and you have to consult with the people that live there. And I don't think that's ever really happened. Secondly, they need to support the businesses, all businesses, not just the Bangladeshi restaurants, particularly around kind of rent, infrastructure. I mean, the classic case of kind of closing the street without bothering to ask anybody whether that was going to work is a good example of that. So certainly rent control, certainly thinking about licensing hours, thinking about transport links, and so on, helping the restaurant owners to adapt to the changes. So we've discovered that very few of the restaurant owners, for example, are kind of linked to things like Deliveroo, and so they're not up to speed with that kind of stuff. So I think there's some support there that needs to be done. One of the main things, I guess, with this audience in particular is just, I mean, I don't live in Brick Lane. I've never lived in Brick Lane. But I feel very passionate. That street is so fascinating. It tells the whole of the story of Britain. You know, it's multiculturalism, it's migration, it's racism, it's anti-racism in that one street. And I think that the contribution of the Bangladeshi community to that has often been underplayed. And it does go back 200 years. And it is about that kind of long presence. It is about that shared solidarity, the things that Abdal and Fatima and Tasnima were talking about, that kind of shared across. And I think that's really important. So I think that is something that hopefully in this next stage of the campaign can be drawn on again.
No, that's it. And I thought it was really interesting, the point that I think Tasnima and Fatima made about how basically the existing curry houses and the existing businesses are basically very sustainable. They primarily employ people who are local, and they get food from the local shops, from the cash and carry, for example, which you mentioned. But obviously the sort of development that we're seeing being proposed will be the absolute opposite of sustainable and local. And it'll be so easy to just wipe away what, as you say, has taken centuries and centuries of history and kind of layering, and what makes it sort of so interesting. We have reached an hour, and I have lots more questions now, and I feel like we've kind of just touched the sort of tip of an iceberg with all this, I'm afraid, but you've all been fantastic and so clear and helpful with it. Thank you so much for joining. I'm gonna share my screen, because the most important thing now is that everybody who is watching this objects to the planning application. So if you can take down these details, or if you can go to the Battle of Brick Lane website and send an objection, that is probably the most important thing that you can do right now to help the future of Brick Lane not be completely anodyne and boring and ruined. So apart from saying thank you to the panelists, I will leave you with these details, but thank you all so much, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.